I'm Jennifer Sanaz. You're watching News 24 Live. Well, I'm joined in studio by our in-house doctor, Dr. Darren Green. Now, as always, he'll be answering your medical questions. Hello.
Good day, good day.
Good to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm always excited to hear your answers from these medical questions we get from our News 24 users. Now, the first one came in on Facebook. The question is, over the last 10 years, I've become allergic to more and more things. Is this normal, or could it be a sign that something else is not functioning properly in my body?
Yeah, the topic of allergies itself is quite interesting because there is certainly a genetic link that makes people susceptible to developing allergies. Yes.
I didn't know
so
that.
If your mom and dad basically struggled with a lot of what we call snortziekte in South Africa, you can think of that's like a post-nasal drip and a runny nose. And basically that's often associated with triggers in the environment, things like house dust mite, things like, for example, weeds, Bermuda grass, even pollen. So the Port Jackson trees, for example, shed so much pollen and can trigger an immune response. So whatever the trigger is, it's an antigen that's inhaled or even ingested in the sense of food, for example, can then trigger an immune response. People that have allergies have an over-eager or an over-excitable immune response. So the presence of this trigger or antigen in the bloodstream causes a dramatic response to it, to welcome it basically, and then to counter it. And it's actually the effects of countering it that cause the symptoms which we suffer from, like the redness, the itchiness, the swelling around the eyes, and the irritation of the skin.
So now, why is she getting more and more? Is that just because she's
generally you'll find that sometimes your sensitivity to substances is lowered. For example, someone might have eaten or consumed fish for a large amount of years and never had a rash or an allergy to iodine, for example. And in late adulthood, they suddenly develop an allergy to it. It's all got to do with the immunomodulation. In other words, the dosage in which the antigen or trigger is present in the bloodstream. Also, what other inflammatory reactions are going on at the time in your body's environment, which make you then susceptible to, the tipping point as to when you start responding to it in an unfavorable fashion.
I hope I never become allergic to fish. That would be horrible.
That would be tragic.
Yes. Now, what can this person do? Can she do anything to counteract this? Or
Definitely, I think
she's just going to have to deal with being allergic to more and more things.
Definitely, I think the first step is to find out what she's allergic to.
Right.
And if there are many things, it might be quite difficult to by means of exclusion identify the one or two things that trigger it. Peanut allergies and eggs, for example, in your diet are very easy. You can see the association in time and place when you ingest them. But if there's a mixture of environmental and dietary triggers, can be quite tricky. And I would recommend that she sees an allergy specialist. They're called allergologists.
Allergologists.
And they specialize in allergic medicine. So they would then look at the serological testing, in other words, the blood work, looking at what specific substances and environmental triggers you are sensitive to, whether it's just grass or weeds, as I said. So, I would start there, taking a good history in terms of the timeline of events. She mentions a 10-year history of progressive symptoms.
Right.
Also, we must mention that there are other systemic medical illnesses associated with allergies that might have problems elsewhere in the body.
Like what?
Like celiac disease, for example, of the gut and the gastrointestinal tract. Often there's an association with a bit of hyperallergic responses.
What is celiac disease?
Celiac disease is an inflammatory disease normally caused by an autoimmune response of the gut, where you can present with an array of non-specific GIT complaints ranging from changes in your stool to abdominal cramps and dyspepsia and swelling and that kind of thing. But obviously this is diagnosed very, very carefully by means of special investigations, and we do things like a colonoscopy and a gastroscopy to confirm that diagnosis.
Now, when you go to the allergologist, do they do that scratch test? Is that still a thing?
You remember the scratch test?
Yes. Do they not do that
Yeah,
anymore?
well, if you have been scratched by a cat, for example, and you see a dramatic flare-up of the skin following that scratch wound, you can imagine that you might have a bit of sensitivity to what they call cat dander, and those are the dry skin cells that you get on horses, cats, and dogs, for example, and that often does it. What we do now often are what's called the RAS test, as well. And then, of course, you get the skin prick assays where they introduce on the forearm of the skin, they introduce the different triggers. And then you can look at the size of the response. The typical rash, which we call urticaria or wheal and flare, that's associated with an allergy, basically becomes a hive that swells up, becomes raised and red, and really, really itchy because of all the histamine release that occurs under the skin.